Throughout the history of basketball, there have been some crazy stories involving players. Some funny stories, some costing players their careers, and some costing players their lives. Welcome to NBA Zone, and in today's video, I'm going to be sharing 4 crazy stories that ruin NBA players' careers.
So, Lenny Wilkins counters with the junkyard dog, Jerome Williams for Morris Peters. Keon Clark slipped away for the slam.
And that got him going.
It's 20-11.
The first story on our list comes from Keon Clark. Now, Keon Clark may be a player many of you have never even heard of, and he didn't have that great of an NBA career. But it's the story behind his career that lands him on this list. Keon Clark was a 13th pick in the 1998 NBA draft by the Orlando Magic, but he would quickly be traded to the Denver Nuggets. Keon would play 3 seasons for the Nuggets, averaging 7 points, 5 rebounds, and 1.3 blocks per game during that time. His years with the Nuggets were fairly stable, and he steadily progressed as a player over that time. Then, in 2001, Keon would be traded to the Toronto Raptors. Here, Keon would actually set a Raptors franchise record for most blocks in a game with 12 blocks in a game against the Atlanta Hawks. After that 1 year with the Raptors, Keon's contract would end and he would sign with the Sacramento Kings. This is when things would become unstable for Keon, as a year later he would be traded from the Kings to the Jazz. Then, later that season, Keon would be traded from the Jazz to the Suns, where he wouldn't even play a game for the team. Keon wouldn't see NBA action for the rest of his life. In 2006, he was due to stand trial on marijuana and weapons charges, but he never showed up. The U.S. Marshals would eventually find Keon, and he was brought back to Danville, Illinois for trial. During his hearing, Keon would admit that he was a recovering alcoholic who had been drinking most of the time since high school. He would then tell the judge that he, quote, never played an NBA game sober. Keon said that by his estimate, he drank half a pint to a pint of gin daily during his pro career, ultimately ruining his career. In 2013, Keon would be sentenced to 8 years in prison on weapon charges, but he would only serve 4 of them. Today, Keon is living a quiet life in his hometown Danville, Illinois, far from where he could have been in his life at this point.
Jerome Williams will be free for the jam. Keon Clark works against Cliff. Doubles on the up fake.
Our second story on this list comes from Latrell Sprewell. A lot of people may not realize this, but Latrell Sprewell once had star potential as a basketball player. Sprewell will be drafted by the Golden State Warriors with the 24th pick in the NBA draft. In his rookie year, Sprewell will put up 15.4 points a game while shooting the highest field goal percentage of his career. In his second NBA season, Sprewell would only get better. He would lead the NBA in minutes per game and also games played, while averaging 21 points and 2.2 steals a game. That would make him an all-star for that season, and he would also be an all-star for his next season. He would have a down year in the 1996 NBA season, but would spring back to be an all-star again the following year. But Sprewell's all-star level of play wouldn't headline his 1997 NBA season, as something far more interesting would happen that would tarnish Sprewell's reputation forever and send him to a downward spiral of personal issues that would plague him for the rest of his career. On December 1st, 1997, during a Warriors practice, Coach PJ Carlesimo would yell at Sprewell about a mistake he had made, and told him to, quote, put a little mustard on his passes. Sprewell responded by telling Carlesimo that he wasn't in the mood for criticism. That's when Carlesimo began to approach Sprewell. That's when Sprewell threatened to kill Carlesimo and proceeded to grab him by the throat and drag him for 7 to 10 seconds before his teammates and coaches finally came to save the day. Sprewell would return 20 minutes later, and things would go bad again. Sprewell would approach Carlesimo again and proceed to punch his coach Carlesimo square in the face. There are many more stories of Sprewell throwing down with his teammates, but we aren't reciting a book today, we're just telling a story. So we'll leave those stories for another time. As far as the rest of Sprewell's career would go, he would be suspended by the Warriors for the remainder of the 1998 season after playing only 14 games. He would then be traded to the New York Knicks, where he would do a relatively good job of staying out of trouble. After that, he would be traded to the Timberwolves, where he would just play 2 seasons. After his second season, he would retire from basketball seemingly out of nowhere, denying a 3-year, $21 million offer from the Timberwolves because he claimed that it wasn't enough to feed his family. That is the note that Sprewell's career would end on.
Arenas will shoot it and hit it at the buzzer. Arenas drives, puts it up.
At the buzzer! Gilbert Arenas hits the game winner for Washington.
The next story on our list comes from Gilbert Arenas. Gilbert Arenas was on his way to a Hall of Fame career in the NBA. During his first 6 years in the league, he proved to be one of the greatest scoring guards of all time. Then from 2008 to 2009, Gilbert would struggle with some injuries that would hamper his performance just a bit. But he would come back in the 2009-2010 season in seemingly perfect form, as he would play the first 34 games of that season and average 22 points and 7 assists per game. But that's when Gilbert would get involved in something so ridiculous that he would never be the same player ever again. While traveling on a plane back to DC, Gilbert Arenas and teammate Javaris Crittenton played a card game where they would gamble a set amount of $1,100. Things must have not went well in that card game because the two players went their separate ways, and Arenas told Crittenton, quote, "I play with guns." That's when Crittenton would reply with, quote, "I play with guns too." Now let's refer to the account from teammate Karam Butler, who witnessed the whole situation. We had the next day off, but on the following day, December 21st, practice started at 10 o'clock at the Verizon Center, so we all wandered in a little earlier. When I entered the locker room, I thought I had somehow been transported back to my days on the streets of Racine. Gilbert was standing in front of his two locker stalls, the ones previously used by Michael Jordan, with 4 guns on display. Javaris was standing in front of his own stall, his back to Gilbert. "Hey motherfucker, come pick one," Gilbert told Javaris while pointing to the weapons. "I'm going to shoot your ass with one of these." "Oh no, you don't need to shoot me with one of those," said Javaris, turning around slowly like a gunslinger in the Old West. "I've got one right here." He pulled out his own gun, already loaded, cocked it, and pointed it at Gilbert. Other players who had been casually arriving, laughing and joking with each other, came to a sudden halt, their eyes bugging out. It only took them a few seconds to realize this was for real, a shoot-around of a whole different nature. They all looked at each other and they ran, the last man locking the door behind them. I didn't panic because I'd been through far worse, heard gunshots more times than I could count, and seen it all before. This would have been just another day on the south side. I talked calmly to Javaris, reminding him that his entire career, not to mention perhaps his life, would be over if he flicked that trigger finger. I looked back at Gilbert. He was silent as he removed himself from the scene. Javaris slowly lowered the gun. I know that Gilbert was thinking, "I went too far. I had a gun pointed at me and it was loaded." Somebody outside the locker room called 911. Flip Saunders was the coach back then, but he was too scared to even come into the locker room. Now back to my dialogue. Just wow. This would result in Arenas being out of the league within 2 years and Javaris Crittenton in prison on a 23-year sentence for shooting a mother of 4 in a gangland.
Gilbert for the win.
You call me most love. I'm coming to the party in the B-boy stands.
Next player on this list is Len Bias. Probably one of the biggest what-if stories in the history of basketball, Len Bias was expected to be the next all-time great of the NBA. Scouts were even comparing him to the likes of Michael Jordan. This was due to Bias's insane athleticism and great playmaking ability. So, with all this hype, Bias would be selected with a second pick by the Boston Celtics in the 1986 NBA draft. It seemed that all of the work Bias had put in would finally come to fruition, and Bias would be an NBA player. Well, that didn't exactly happen. After the draft, Len Bias would return home to Maryland. After returning home to Maryland, Bias retrieved his newly leased sports car and drove back to his room on the campus of the University of Maryland. He then dined out with some teammates and a member of the football team. Afterwards, Bias would drive to an off-campus gathering and spend a short amount of time there before eventually returning to his Maryland dorm. For the next 3 to 4 hours, Bias, longtime friend Brian Tribble, and several teammates repeatedly insufflated cocaine in the dormitory suite shared by Bias and his teammates. According to the campus timeline, Bias had a seizure and collapsed sometime between 6:25 and 6:32 a.m. while talking with teammate Terry Long. At 6:32 a.m., when the 911 call to Prince George's County Emergency Services was made by Tribble, Bias was unconscious and not breathing. All attempts by the emergency medical team to restart his heart and breathing were unsuccessful. After additional attempts to revive him at Leland Memorial Hospital in Riverdale, Maryland, Bias was pronounced dead at 8:55 a.m. of cardiac arrhythmia related to usage of cocaine. So, Len Bias never got to play in an NBA game, and it will forever be a mystery what he could have been as a basketball player. So that's going to do it for today's video. What are your favorite stories from basketball's past? Let us know down in the comments below. Also, if you like this video, then drop a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.